There's a kind of silence that only happens after something goes very wrong. Not the quiet of an empty room. Not the peaceful kind you find at the end of a long day. This is the silence that falls when a crowd of men, loud, laughing, untouchable men, suddenly stop making noise. When the jokes die in their throats. When the general, the man everyone in that room had spent years trying to impress, goes still in a way that has nothing to do with confidence. That silence fell in a military courtyard in the spring of 2019. And the person who caused it was a woman who didn't weigh 140 pounds soaking wet. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss, U.S. Navy SEAL, one of fewer than 20 women in American history to survive the training that breaks most men before the first week is done. She had crawled through mud in the dark for 72 hours straight. She had been held underwater until the edges of her vision turned black, and she had not tapped out. She had done things in foreign countries that will not appear in any document with her name on it for another 40 years, maybe longer. She did not walk into that courtyard looking for a fight. But the general's men started one anyway. What happened next became the kind of story that travels quietly through military circles, passed from soldier to soldier in mess halls and debriefs and late-night vehicle rides through places no one maps. Not because it is a story about a woman beating men, though that is part of it, but because it is a story about what happens when power mistakes itself for invincibility. When rank becomes a costume a man wears so well he forgets it's just fabric. When someone finally, in front of everyone, reminds him. This is that story, not the cleaned-up version, not the one that gets summarized in a memo or filtered through a public affairs officer. The real one with the dust and the anger and the moment that everyone in that courtyard felt something shift, some unspoken rule rewritten in real time. Some people call it the day the general got humbled. The people who were there, who saw her face right before it started, call it something else. They call it the day she stopped letting it go. Sarah Voss was 11 years old the first time a man told her she couldn't do something because of what she was. It was her father's friend, a retired Army corporal named Dennis, who said it at a backyard barbecue in rural Virginia with a beer in one hand and absolute certainty in the other. Sarah had just told the table she wanted to join the military. The men laughed, not the mean kind, the dismissive kind, which is somehow worse, and Dennis leaned back in his plastic lawn chair and said, "Little girls don't go to war, sweetheart." Sarah didn't argue. She was 11. She didn't have the words yet. But she looked at Dennis with a steadiness that made him shift in his chair, and she filed it away somewhere deep in the part of herself that she would spend the next 20 years building into something unbreakable. She grew up in Clover, Virginia. Population, small enough that everyone knew your business. Large enough that you could feel invisible if you walked the wrong street at the wrong time. Her father, Robert Voss, was a quiet man who had done one tour in the Marines before a training injury ended his service career and pointed him toward a hardware store he would run for the next 3 decades. Her mother, June, taught 4th grade and believed deeply in 2 things, good manners and getting back up. Sarah was their only daughter. She had 2 older brothers, Marcus and Terrell, who treated her the way most older brothers treat younger sisters, like a minor inconvenience who occasionally surprised them. She ran faster than both of them by the time she was 13. By 15, she was doing pull-ups off the garage door frame every morning before school. By 17, she had read every book in the county library that mentioned special operations, and she had made a list. The list had one item on it, BUD/S, Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training. The most physically and psychologically brutal military selection program in the United States Armed Forces. A course designed, and this was not an exaggeration, it was engineering, to make human beings quit. The dropout rate hovered between 70 and 80% in most years. Men who had been athletes their whole lives, men who had trained specifically for BUD/S for years, drove hours to Coronado, California, and did not make it past the first week. Sarah knew all of this. She had read the accounts. She had studied the physiology, the cold water hypothermia thresholds, the sleep deprivation research. She was not naive about what she was aiming at. She was aiming at it anyway. It took her the better part of a decade to get there. She enlisted at 18, spent her first 4 years in naval intelligence, distinguished herself quickly enough that her commanding officer pushed her toward officer candidate school, and she went through it the way she went through most things without making a lot of noise and without losing. She received her commission, deployed twice in support roles that brought her close enough to the special operations world to confirm what she already believed. This was where she belonged. The door had been closed for most of American military history. In 2015, it opened. The Department of Defense lifted the combat exclusion policy that had kept women out of special operations units. Sarah was 26 years old when the announcement was made. She was in a deployment vehicle in a country she cannot name when she read it on a satellite-connected tablet. And she did not celebrate out loud because the men around her were watching, and she had learned by then that the watching never really stopped. She applied for SEAL assessment the following month. The men in her unit said various things. Some were supportive, or at least neutral, which in that environment counted for something. A few were skeptical in the honest way. They didn't think she would make it, but they weren't angry about her trying. And then there were a handful who were something else. Something she had no clean word for, though over time, she developed a shorthand for it in her own head. She called it the problem. The problem was not hostility, exactly. It was something more ambient, more structural. It was the assumption that her presence required justification in a way that there's never had. The assumption that she was the experiment, and they were the standard. She went to Coronado in February of 2016. Bud/S election is broken into phases, and the first of them is designed to break you so completely that whatever is left either has to be real or it has to quit. The first week, Hell Week, is 5.5 days of continuous physical evolution. No sleep, cold water, wet sand, 200 pounds of log carried on screaming shoulders, and an instructional staff that is professionally, deliberately, relentlessly trying to find your limit and push through it until you tap out. 41 men started with Sarah's class. 6 men made it through Hell Week. Sarah was the 7th. She would not talk about what Hell Week was like. Not to journalists, not to researchers, not even, for the most part, to people she trusted. There was a version of it she would tell, the physical facts, the cold temperatures, the log PT, the surf torture, and then there was the version underneath that, the version that lived in her body in the form of a specific kind of exhaustion that never quite left, even years later, even in comfortable rooms. She had been to the edge of herself and looked over and decided the edge was not the end. That was all she ever said about it. She finished BUD/S first in her class. Not first among women. First, period. The graduation ceremony was quiet by design. There was no press. The military had made a careful institutional decision to manage the optics of early female SEAL completions, which meant keeping them low profile, which also meant that some of the men who should have been forced to reckon with what Sarah had accomplished never had to. She was handed her trident in a room with 40 people, and the news traveled through channels rather than headlines, and within a week, she was assigned to an East Coast SEAL team, and the work began. The work was real. It was the kind of real that rewrites whatever you thought you knew about yourself before it. She deployed 3 times in her first 4 years after selection. The details are classified in ways that make discussing them precisely impossible, but the shape of it is knowable. She went to hard places and did difficult things alongside men who, over time, stopped noticing she was a woman and started just noticing she was good. That transition, she would later say in a private conversation with a fellow officer, was the only form of acceptance she had ever actually wanted. Not warmth, not celebration, just the flat, professional recognition that she was there because she was capable of being there. She got it mostly in her team, among people who had seen her work. Outside of that, in the broader world of military hierarchy, in the rooms where generals held court and junior officers learned how to read the temperature and adjust accordingly, it was more complicated. The culture she had broken into was old. It had its own gravity, and gravity does not care what the regulations say. She was promoted to lieutenant commander in the spring of 2018. The promotion was uncontroversial in terms of merit. Her record was the kind that gets referenced in briefings as a benchmark. But promotions change your orbit. They put you in different rooms, around different people, in situations with a different kind of weight. One of those rooms was the Combined Joint Task Force headquarters at a forward operating base in a Middle Eastern country whose name does not appear in this document. She arrived there in January 2019, attached to a multi-branch planning cell as a senior advisor for unconventional warfare. The base was large by the standards of the region, several hundred personnel, a mix of American, British, and Allied forces, the kind of organized complexity that takes months to learn and years to master. Brigadier General Howard Cutler ran that base. Cutler was 53 years old, a career Army officer who had come up through Ranger selection, and then airborne, and then a series of command positions that had left him with the particular certainty a man who had been right so many times in such high-stakes situations that he had stopped being able to distinguish between the confidence that experience earns and the arrogance that comfort builds. He was not a bad general in the tactical sense. He made reasonable decisions and kept his people alive at a rate that justified his rank. But he had a way of being in a room, a way of taking up space, of conducting the air around him, of looking at junior officers, that communicated something beyond authority. It communicated that the hierarchy was personal. That rank was not just institutional, it was moral. That the people above you in the chain were not just in charge of your career, they were, in some fundamental way, better. Sarah had encountered men like Cutler before. She understood the type. She had spent her entire adult life learning how to be effective inside systems built by and for men like Cutler, and she had developed a precise, functional approach to it. Do the work, stay visible through results, and do not give anyone a reason to remember you for anything except your performance. It had worked. It had gotten her here. It almost worked with Cutler. She spent her first 3 weeks on base without incident. She attended briefings, contributed analysis, ran planning sessions that the British liaison later described, in a document that would become relevant, as among the most operationally sophisticated he had encountered at the advisory level. She ate in the mess hall, ran her miles before sunrise, maintained the kind of low-friction presence that keeps things smooth in joint environments where egos and institutional cultures are constantly negotiating. Then, General Cutler's inner circle found her. Not Cutler himself, not at first. His people. 3 of them, a major named Holt, a captain named Driscoll, and a staff sergeant named Yates, who operated just outside the formal command structure in the way that certain enlisted men do when they've been with a general long enough to absorb his immunity. They were, by any reasonable measure, doing what men like them do in environments like that one, establishing the social order, identifying who was worth taking seriously and who could be used for entertainment. They identified Sarah as the latter. It started as comments. Small ones. The kind that live in the gap between reportable and tolerable. Close enough to professional that you couldn't escalate without looking oversensitive, far enough from professional that you understood exactly what was happening. Observations about her size, about her specialty, about whether female operators were really operators or whether they were a different kind of asset, delivered with a smile that meant the speaker knew what he was saying and was watching to see if she did too. She did. She always did. And she did what she had trained herself to do. She let go. She had let it go 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. Because the math was simple. Responding in that environment cost more than absorbing. Escalating meant becoming a problem rather than an asset. Becoming a problem meant losing the operational access that was the entire point of being there. She was not there to correct the culture. She was there to do her job. She let it go in week 4. She let go in week 5. In week 6, General Cutler held his monthly command-wide formation. 214 personnel assembled in the main courtyard in the mid-morning heat. It was a routine event. Administrative announcements, performance recognitions, the general visible and in command the way formations exist to make him visible and in command. Sarah stood in her place in the naval component section and was present in the way she was present everywhere. Attentive, still completely there. Cutler moved through his remarks. Standard material, operational updates, a unit commendation, some logistical adjustments to meal schedules that made the formation feel like what it technically was, institutional maintenance. Then he paused. He was standing at the front of the formation, microphone in hand, and he looked across the assembled ranks and found her. Sarah would later say she didn't know how she knew he had found her before he spoke. Some combination of the angle of his body, the way his 214-person audience had slightly shifted its attention, the small physics of power directing itself. He found her, and in front of 214 people, with a microphone in his hand, General Howard Cutler made a joke. It was the kind of joke that has a technical innocence. You could, if you worked at it, transcribe it and find nothing prosecutable in the words. But the delivery, the target, the timing, the audience, the specific history of everything that had already happened in those 6 weeks, all of it made the meaning precise. He was telling the formation, with a microphone and a smile, that she did not fully belong there, that her presence was a novelty, that the hierarchy, in its most honest form, did not quite include her. The formation laughed. Not all of them, maybe a third, and mostly from the section closest to Holt and Driscoll and Yates. But a third of 214 is 71 people, and 71 people laughing in a courtyard makes a sound. Sarah stood still. She had a specific face she used for moments like this. Not a blank face. Blank would be noticeable, would be its own signal. It was more precise than blank. It was the face of someone processing information without reaction, the way a piece of very well-made equipment processes an impact. She had practiced it. She had built it over years. She stood in formation and wore that face and let the laugh move through the courtyard and disappear. Cutler moved on. The formation ended. Personnel dispersé. Sarah walked back to her workspace and sat down at her desk and looked at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. Then she went back to work. She wrote 2 analysis memos that afternoon. She ran her planning cell session at 1,600 hours. She ate dinner in the mess hall at the same table she always ate at, and she spoke to the same 2 British officers she usually spoke to, and she smiled when the conversation was funny, and she did not make any of what had happened visible in any way that the room could read. The British liaison, Major Tom Carver, watched her across the table that evening and said nothing during dinner. After walking back toward the billets in the cooling desert evening, he fell in a step beside her. "You all right?" he said. She looked at him. Carver was a good officer, the kind who noticed things and had the self-awareness not to make that noticing performative. "I'm fine," she said. He nodded, believed her, or knew better than to push it. She went to her bunk that night and lay in the dark and did the math one more time. The math she had been doing since she was a junior officer, learning the rules of the environment she had chosen. The math that compared the cost of absorbing against the cost of responding. The math that had always, until now, come out the same way. Lie there in the dark. Do the math. This time it came out different. She didn't know exactly what form the difference was going to take. She didn't have a plan. Not yet. She was an impulsive person. She had survived too much through deliberation to become impulsive now. But she felt, in the specific physical way she felt things that mattered, that something had shifted, that she had reached the end of a long, patient accounting and arrived at a number she was no longer willing to carry. She thought about Dennis in the lawn chair with the beer. She thought about the 71 people laughing in the courtyard. She thought about the 6 years since BUD/S and the 1,000 rooms and the 1,000 moments of letting it go. And she understood with a clarity that felt almost chemical that the letting go had never actually made it go. It had just moved the cost. She closed her eyes. Outside the bunk, the bass settled into its nighttime rhythms. Generators, distant vehicles, the particular desert quiet that isn't quiet at all but sounds like it compared to everything else. She listened to it for a while, measured her breathing the way she had learned to measure it in cold, dark water with her hands tied. She thought, not yet. She thought, but not forever. She went to sleep. 3 days later, Holt cornered her in the corridor outside the planning cell after a briefing. Just the 2 of them in a hallway that was temporarily empty the way corridors in busy buildings occasionally empty for 30 seconds between waves of foot traffic. He said something to her. It was brief and targeted and delivered in a voice pitched low enough that it would not carry if anyone rounded the corner. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was absolutely level, "You're going to want to stop doing that." Holt smiled. The kind of smile that means, "I don't believe you mean that." "Or what?" he said. She held his gaze for one more second. Then she picked up her materials and walked past him without touching him, without hurrying, without any visible indication that anything of significance had occurred. She went into the planning cell and closed the door behind her. Holt told Driscoll. Driscoll told Yates. Yates mentioned it to the general in passing, with a smile, as though it were amusing. Cutler, who had built an entire career on reading threat assessments correctly, heard the anecdote and felt nothing he recognized as concern. He would remember that later. The not feeling concerned. He would remember it as the last time he felt entirely certain about Sarah Voss. The incident that ended all of that, the one that would travel through military circles for years, that would get told and retold across mess halls and vehicle rides and late-night briefings in languages she didn't speak, was still 11 days away. It started with a morning run. She ran every morning at 0530. This was not unusual. Most operators ran. It was foundational maintenance. And the base had a cleared perimeter track that was in use from about 0500 to 0700 with enough regularity that you knew who you'd pass and roughly when. She knew Holt's schedule. She knew Driscoll's. She knew, from the 6 weeks of careful watching, that was her professional baseline, roughly what the morning looked like on that track. On a Tuesday morning in early March, in a temperature that would be brutal by noon but was still bearable at sunrise, she laced up and went out. She was not looking for anything to happen. She was running. The track was quiet for the first 2 miles. The desert light was low and orange, and the base was waking up around her with the sounds of machinery and distance. She found her pace, the long, efficient stride she'd developed over years of running in full kit, and let the miles accumulate. She was halfway through mile 3 when she heard them behind her. Not one set of footsteps. Several. She didn't turn around. She adjusted her breathing and kept her pace and listened. They were gaining. Faster than her current pace, which was not a casual pace. She heard the particular sound of boots hitting packed dirt in a coordinated way that meant they were together. Not a coincidence of runners at the same time, but a group running as a group. She recognized Holt's voice before she made out the words. She ran. They closed the distance. She had a choice. Several choices. She inventoried them with the clinical speed of someone trained to assess tactical situations in real time, even when the tactical situation was a morning run on a base that was technically friendly territory. She could accelerate and probably maintain the gap and arrive at the end of the track and go inside and let it be a thing that happened and didn't happen. She could slow and let them pass and do the same. She could stop, turn, and deal with whatever this was directly. Her feet kept moving. The math ran in the background. They reached her at the halfway point of the track. There were 3 of them, Holt, Driscoll, and a 4th man she didn't know well, a young corporal named Reese, who had the look of someone who didn't quite understand the situation he had walked into, but had committed to walking into it anyway. They pulled up alongside her and matched her pace, and Holt said something loud enough to be heard over the sound of running that was a version of everything he had been saying for 6 weeks, compressed into one sentence, delivered at sunrise with the confidence of a man who had never been made to account for anything he said. She ran 3 more steps. She stopped. They stopped a beat behind her because she stopped without warning, and the body responds to physical proximity before the brain catches up with a plan. She turned, and this is where the story splits. There is the version of what happened next that Holt told, and the version Driscoll told, and the version that Reese, who was the youngest and the most honest and the one who had the least invested in a particular narrative, told afterward when the situation had escalated to the point where telling the truth became less costly than maintaining the lie. Reese said, she didn't touch him first. Reese said, Holt got in her face, like actually in her face, and she said something to him, I couldn't hear it, and then he put his hand on her. Reese said, I think he thought that would end it. What happened in the next 4 seconds, the 4 seconds that became the story, was not complicated. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense of the word. It was fast, and it was precise, and it was the specific kind of efficient that you only get from someone who has spent years training in exactly the circumstances they are now in. Holt went from vertical to horizontal in a way that the sand remembered for most of the morning. He did not get up immediately. Driscoll stood still. Reese stood still. The desert held its temperature. She looked at them both, the standing ones, for long enough that the message was received in full. Then, she turned and resumed her run. She finished her miles. She showered, ate breakfast, and was in her workspace by 0700. The report landed on General Cutler's desk by 0900. He read it. Then, he read it again. Then, he looked up from his desk at the wall of his office for a moment that his aide, who was sitting across the room, would later describe as the general being very quiet in a way he usually isn't. He called for a meeting. The meeting was scheduled for 1,400 hours in the main briefing room. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Sarah had already made 2 phone calls that morning. One to the Naval Special Warfare Command legal office. One to Major Carver. She sat in her planning cell between those calls and her 1400 appointment and did her work. She had 2 analysis memos to finish and a targeting matrix to review, and she gave them her full attention because that was what she did. She gave things her full attention, even when other things were happening, especially when other things were happening. At 13:55, she picked up her materials. At 13:57, she walked down the corridor toward the briefing room. At 1400, she opened the door. The general was already there. So were Holt and Driscoll and 3 other senior officers and the base JAG and Major Carver, who was sitting at the far end of the table with a neutral expression that meant he had prepared carefully for exactly this. Cutler looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. The room was very quiet. She sat down, and General Howard Cutler, who had spent 30 years in command of rooms like this one, who had sat at the head of briefing tables in 3 wars and understood power in the way only men who had wielded it for decades understand it, felt, for the first time and longer than he could immediately recall, that he was not entirely certain how this meeting was going to end. She had not spoken yet. She put her materials on the table and folded her hands and waited. Outside, the desert morning was becoming the desert afternoon. 214 personnel were moving through their routines on a base that did not yet know what was about to change. The door closed. The meeting began. The briefing room on that base had a specific smell, recycled air and dried dust, and the particular chemical quality of filtered water that had been sitting in plastic containers in the heat for too long. Sarah had been in that room 12 times before that afternoon. She had sat in the same chair at the same side of the table and delivered analysis that was used in operational decisions that affected real things in the real world, and she had done it without drawing attention to herself, which was the skill she had spent the longest time perfecting. Sitting there now, with Cutler at the head of the table and everyone else arranged by rank and proximity, she did not feel afraid. She had expected to feel something close to afraid, had prepared for that possibility, had run through the internal protocol she used for high-stress environments, the breathing, the grounding, the specific mental habit of separating what is happening from what it means so that the meaning doesn't flood the moment before you're ready to use it. She had done all of that on the walk down the corridor. She did not need it. What she felt instead was something she recognized from water, from a specific kind of cold that comes from an ocean in February in the dark when your hands are bound and your body is screaming in a language older than thought, and you understand, not intellectually in your cells, that the only 2 options are to keep moving or to stop, that the stopping is not rest, that the stopping is something else entirely. She felt the same way she had felt in that water, completely, specifically, unsentimentally awake. Cutler opened the meeting the way Cutler opened everything, from a position of assumed authority that was not a posture, but a habit so old it had become structure. He set the situation, the morning incident on the track, the report filed by Major Holt, the nature of the alleged action. His tone was measured. He was not performing anger. He was performing due process, which was in some ways more dangerous because it dressed the outcome in procedure. He looked at her when he had finished laying it out. "Lieutenant Commander Voss," he said, "this is your opportunity to give your account of this morning." She looked at him. Then she opened a folder she had carried in and placed 3 pages on the table. She slid them toward the base JAG, a captain named Alvarez, who took them with the careful hands of someone who has just understood that the meeting he prepared for is not the meeting he's in. "Those are time-stamped communications from the Naval Special Warfare Command legal office," she said. "The first is a formal harassment complaint filed at 0730 this morning covering 6 weeks of documented incidents. The second is a chain of prior documentation I submitted to my own command as a protective record on 3 separate dates in February and March. The third is Major Carver's voluntary corroborating statement, provided this morning." The room did not produce sound for a moment. "I want to be very clear about the sequence," she said. "Major Holt's report was filed at 0854. My complaint was filed at 0730, which means the narrative that brought us all to this table this afternoon, that I am here because of what I did on that track this morning, is an accurate description of only part of the morning. The rest of the morning began earlier than Major Holt's account and in a different place. Cutler was looking at her with an expression that was not anger. It was something more complex and harder to name. The expression of a man recalculating. Major Holt reports that you physically assaulted him, Cutler said, without provocation. Major Holt made physical contact with me, she said. I responded. The word assault is in his document, which was filed after mine, which is a chronological fact. I would ask the JAG to note that Corporal Reese, who was present, has not signed Major Holt's report, which is a second chronological fact. Alvarez was reading. She could see his eyes moving down the pages. Beside him, the most senior of the other officers, a colonel named Prentice, who Sarah had assessed early on as a man who understood institutional risk, had gone very still in the way that careful people go still when they are thinking faster than the room. Holt was at the far end of the table. He had a piece of paper in front of him that he was not looking at. He was looking at the table's surface. His jaw was doing something that suggested he was working to keep his face in order. He had a bruise developing along the left side of his chin that the room was not commenting on, though everyone had noticed it. The not commenting was its own kind of commentary. Cutler leaned back, just slightly, the small calibration of a man deciding how to hold the ground. Lieutenant Commander, he said, regardless of his sequence of paperwork filed, the conduct on that track was a response to a 6-week pattern of targeted professional harassment conducted by personnel under your direct command, she said. General, the morning did not begin at the track. The morning did not begin today. The morning began 6 weeks ago, in the 3rd week of my assignment here, when Major Holt first made comments that I documented and absorbed and managed professionally because I believe the institutional cost of escalating was too high. The room was listening. All of it, even the people trying not to listen. Even Holt, who had stopped looking at the table and was looking at her now with an expression that was fear doing its best impression of contempt. That calculation, she said, was wrong. Not because I made it incorrectly, but because absorbing it sent a message I did not intend to send. It communicated tolerance. And the tolerance, General, with respect, reached its limit this morning when a member of your staff put his hand on me. She said the last 5 words without raising her voice, without emphasis, in the exact same tone she had used for everything else. The even tone was the emphasis. The room understood that. Prentice was the first to move. He reached for the documents. Alvarez let him take the top page without protest, which told Sarah something about how Prentice and Alvarez had just recalibrated relative to each other in the last 45 seconds. Cutler was looking at her. She let him look. She had been looked at by generals before. She had been in rooms where power was pointed at her the way a flashlight is pointed at something in the dark. Not warmly, not hostilely, just with the expectation that the illumination would reveal a thing that could be managed. She had learned that the secret to those rooms was this. The power of the look depended entirely on whether the looked-at person believed in it. She did not. Not because she was reckless. She was one of the least reckless people she knew. But because she had spent 6 weeks calculating the cost of this moment and had arrived at the conclusion that the cost was acceptable. She had done the math in the dark, and the math had told her, not forever. And she had waited until the moment had the right shape, and now it had the right shape, and she was here. She was completely, unsentimentally here. Cutler said, "You should have come to me." She looked at him. "You were at the formation," she said. The sentence was 4 words. It sat in the room like a piece of evidence. Everyone in that room had been at the formation. Everyone in that room had heard the microphone and the laughter. The 4 words did not explain this. They did not need to. Cutler's jaw moved. He looked at the wall for 1 second. Then he looked at Prentice. The look that colonels and generals exchange when the situation has moved past what either of them anticipated, and they are, without saying it, negotiating how to proceed. Prentice gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Cutler looked back at Sarah. "We will need to address this fully," he said. "Through proper channels." "Yes," she said. "We will." She picked up her folder. She stood. "I want to be clear," she said. "I am not requesting removal from this assignment. I am requesting that the personnel whose behavior is documented in those pages be formally addressed. I am requesting that the formation incident be included in that review. And I am requesting that the JAG confirm in writing that my complaint was filed prior to Major Holt's report." She looked at Alvarez. Alvarez, who was a careful man and had just understood the full geometry of the room, said, "That will be confirmed." She looked at Cutler one more time. "General," she said. She left the room. The corridor outside was empty. She walked to the end of it and turned the corner and stood for a moment with her back against the wall in a section of the building where no one was. She breathed, the specific, deliberate way she had learned to breathe when the thing was over and the body needed permission to respond. Her hands were not shaking. This surprised her slightly. She had expected them to shake. They didn't. She went back to her workspace and reviewed the targeting matrix she had left half-finished at 13:55. The base, outside her window, continued its afternoon. What happened in the next 72 hours was procedural on the surface and seismic underneath. Alvarez filed his confirmation. Prentice, who had spent the afternoon reading the full documentation and conducting what one later report would describe as spontaneous informal interviews with 3 witnesses, including Corporal Reese, produced an 8-page summary that was sent up the chain with his personal recommendation for formal review. Holt was removed from his current duties pending investigation. Driscoll received a formal counseling session that would appear in his record. Yates, the staff sergeant, the outermost circle, was transferred to a different section of the base, which was technically administrative and functionally permanent. General Cutler was not reprimanded. Not formally, not yet. There would be a conversation at a higher level. She knew this. Major Carver knew this. Prentice almost certainly knew this. But conversations at higher levels in the military move at their own pace, in their own register, and do not announce themselves. What happened on the base, in the immediate aftermath, was something more tangible. The way people walked near her changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be reported or described in a memo. But the microphysics of shared space, the way eyes move and don't move, the way bodies angle or don't angle, the small social adjustments of people recalibrating around someone who has just demonstrated something about themselves, all of it shifted. She noticed it because she noticed everything. She filed it away without attaching meaning to it, because meaning was the kind of thing she had learned to let develop rather than assign. She ate dinner at her usual table. Major Carver sat down across from her at the usual time. He looked at her. His face was doing the thing it did when he was restraining something. "You all right?" he said. She considered the question the way she considered all questions. "Actually, yes," she said. He nodded. He picked up his fork. Then he put it down. "For the record," he said, "I have never personally met anyone who plans the way you plan." "Operational habit," she said. "You filed that complaint at 0730. "I filed it at 0730, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork again. "I've been in the British Army for 17 years, he said. "I would like a note, for whatever record exists of this dinner, that I am glad you're on our side." She almost smiled. The thing she did with her face that was close to a smile without quite being one. "Eat your food," she said. He ate his food. She ate hers. The desert outside was doing what deserts do in March, cooling from the day's heat with a speed that felt like relief, the temperature dropping the way tension drops after a decision has been made and can't be unmade. She had learned in deployments in these kinds of places to like that cooling, to find it honest. The heat of the day was performance. The cool of the night was the truth of the temperature. She thought about that, the temperature and its truths. She had been operating in heat for a long time. The specific heat of environments where the rules said one thing and the practice said another, where she was formally welcome and functionally on trial, where the cost of being herself was paid in increments so small she sometimes couldn't feel them until she added them up. She had added them up, in the dark, on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, when the math came out different. She did not feel, eating dinner with Major Carver in the cooling desert evening, that she had won something. Victory was not the word her mind reached for. What she felt was something closer to alignment, the specific, physical sense that her external situation had finally caught up with her internal arithmetic. She had stopped carrying the cost sideways. She had put it down. 2 days later, she was called to a meeting with Cutler. This one was different. No JAG, no preenches, no audience. Just her and the general in his office, which was a different room than the briefing room. Smaller, more personal, with photographs on the wall, and a desk that was organized in the way of a man who uses order as a management tool. She had been in this office twice before for routine briefings. She sat in the same chair she had sat in both times. Cutler sat across from her. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent 2 days thinking about something and had not arrived at a comfortable conclusion. I want to speak directly, he said. Please, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that precedes honesty in people who are not naturally given to it. What I said at the formation, he said, that was not appropriate. She waited. I want you to know, he said, that it was not intended as general, she said. I know what it was intended as. He stopped. She looked at him with an even face. The processing face. It was intended to establish to 214 people that my presence here was not entirely serious, she said. I understand why that was useful to you. I'm not asking you to admit that now. I'm telling you that I understand it, because I want this conversation to be honest. Something moved in his face. Not remorse. Not exactly. Remorse was a word for things that surprised you, and she did not think she had surprised Cutler. Not truly. It was something more like the expression of a man standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged. Same room, different geometry, requiring different movement. I've been told, he said, that your assessment work here has been exceptional. I know it has, she said. He blinked. The people who have told me that, she said, include Major Carver, who is excellent at his job and has no reason to say things he doesn't mean. I don't say that to be difficult. I say it because my presence here has a purpose that is separate from this conversation, and I intend to continue fulfilling it. Cutler was quiet for a moment. Is there anything, he said, that you need for me to continue doing your job effectively? She considered the question. Yes, she said. One thing. He waited. The next time someone under your command does something in your presence that you know is wrong, she said, I would like you to address it before it sits in the sun for 6 weeks. The room was very still. That's all, she said. She picked up her materials. She stood, she said, without drama, without victory, without anything that could be mistaken for triumph. Thank you for your time, General. She left his office. The base was at its mid-morning rhythm. People moving, equipment running, the structured noise of several hundred people doing their jobs in a large, complex, organized place. She walked through it toward her workspace without hurrying, without slowing, with a long, economical stride that ate ground without announcing intention. She was thinking about the targeting matrix. She had found an inconsistency in the third column the previous afternoon that she wanted to review with 2 fresh eyes and a coffee that was slightly better than the one available in the planning cell. She had exactly 40 minutes before her 1,000 briefing. She made the coffee. She sat at her desk. She opened the matrix. She worked. Outside, the desert morning was committing itself to the desert day, the temperature rising toward the 100-degree middle that would make everyone slow and careful. In the briefing room and the corridors and the mess hall and the perimeter track, the base was doing what it did, adapting, adjusting, recalibrating around the new shape of things. 2 weeks later, a colonel from the Inspector General's office arrived on base. He was there for 5 days. During those 5 days, 17 people gave formal statements. Sarah was among them. She sat across from the IG colonel in a small conference room and gave her account in a methodical, documented way. She gave all accounts, from the beginning, in sequence, without editorializing, with specific dates and times and words quoted verbatim where she could remember them and paraphrased where she couldn't, with a clear marking of which was which. She had a very good memory. The IG colonel, whose name was Sheridan, listened to her with the focused attention of someone who had done a great many of these interviews and could identify precisely when he was getting the real account versus the managed one. At the end of her statement, he looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked up. Lieutenant Commander, he said, in your assessment, were there other personnel on this base who witnessed behavior consistent with what you described? She thought about this. Yes, she said. Did any of them intervene at the time? No, she said. He wrote something. One of them, she said, provided a statement voluntarily before this investigation began. Major Carver, Sheridan said. Yes, she said. He wrote something else. Is there anything, he said, that you would want included in this record that isn't captured in your formal statement? She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I want it noted that the decision to file the complaint when I filed it was a deliberate one, that I waited 6 weeks, that I was doing the institutional math the whole time, and that the fact that a female SEAL has to do institutional math for 6 weeks in an environment that should be, by regulation, by culture, by basic operational logic, focused entirely on the mission, is itself a finding. Sheridan looked at her. That's not something I can formally put in the report, he said. I know, she said. I want it noted that I said it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. The kind of nod that means, I heard you, and I will carry it, and it will live in the record in the way that things live in records when they can't live in reports. Thank you for your time, he said. She nodded, stood, picked up her materials. She went back to work. The base went on. Operational tempo doesn't pause for investigations. The mission doesn't recalibrate around institutional process. She ran her planning cells and wrote her analysis and sat in briefings and ate her meals and ran her miles in the morning, and the days stacked on each other the way days do in deployed environments, dense and identical looking on the outside and specific and unrepeatable on the inside. Cutler ran his base. He ran it differently, she thought, or perhaps she was reading something into the change because she was looking for it. But there was a difference in the formations that followed, a flatness, a professionalism that was precise in the way that things become precise when someone has been shown their imprecision. Whether it would last beyond the deployment, beyond the investigation, beyond the particular weight of the moment, she did not know. She did not think it was her job to know. Her job was to be there, and to do the work, and to be the thing that some theoretical future woman, some 11-year-old who had not been told yet to file it away, might one day be told existed. That was the job underneath the job. She had understood this for a long time. She ran her miles in the early desert morning. The air at 0530 was the best it would be all day, cool and clean and thin in the way desert air is thin, carrying the specific smell of rock and distance. She ran through it with a long stride and the measured breathing and the mind doing what minds do during the body's work, processing, cataloging, turning things over. She was thinking about the targeting matrix. She had found another inconsistency, a different one in the second column now, and she was running the analysis in parallel with her feet, the way she did her best thinking, moving. The track was quiet. Other runners were there, as always, but not near her, and she moved through the early light with the particular solitude of someone in motion in open space, which is its own country, with its own rules. She passed a place where she had stopped on that Tuesday morning. The sand there looked like any other sand. It did not remember what had happened there. She kept moving. The sun was beginning its serious ascent, the orange of the horizon giving way to the white gold of real morning. The base stirred and hummed. Somewhere on the south side, a helicopter was cycling up. She finished her miles. She stretched at the edge of the track, methodical, each muscle group in order, the routine that kept the body honest. Around her, the morning was completing its arrival. The day was becoming the day. She picked up her water bottle. She went inside. She showered. She made her coffee. She sat at her desk and opened the targeting matrix and found the inconsistency in the second column and began the work of understanding it. She had a 1,000 briefing and a 1,400 planning session and 3 reports to review before the end of the day, and she was already running mental calculations on the order in which she would address them, the specific sequence that would make the most efficient use of the hours. She had always been good at sequencing. Outside her window, the base was fully awake now, the machinery of the day in motion. General Cutler was in his office. Major Carver was in his. The people who had given statements to the IG colonel had gone back to their duties and were carrying the experience of the previous weeks in the way people carry things, invisibly in the cellular way, in the slight adjustment of how they move through spaces and assess situations and made decisions about what to let go and what to name. She was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about the second column. She found the inconsistency at 0823. By 0900, she had its source. By 0945, she had a correction and a recommendation. She picked up her materials at 0955 and walked toward the briefing room for the 1000. She walked through the corridor without hurrying. She passed 2 junior officers who nodded at her with a nod that was different from the nod of 6 weeks ago, in a way that was small and real and not discussed and did not need to be. She nodded back. She pushed open the briefing room door. She sat down. She opened her folder. The briefing began. The IG report was filed on Thursday. Sarah did not receive a copy directly. That was not how it worked. The report moved upward through channels, through the specific institutional plumbing of the military hierarchy, which had its own pressure and its own pace, and did not distribute findings the way a court distributes verdicts. What she knew was what Alvarez confirmed. The report had been filed, and it was substantive, and it was going somewhere. She filed that information in the part of her brain reserved for things that were true but no longer actionable, and she went back to work. The deployment had 9 weeks left. 9 weeks is a long time in an operational environment and a short time in the broader sweep of things, and she experienced it as both, as dense weeks where the work was real and specific and demanding, and as a sprint toward a conclusion that was moving at its own speed regardless of what she did. She ran her planning cells. She wrote her analysis. She attended briefings and contributed to them and ate her meals and ran her miles and did the daily work of being exactly where she was supposed to be and doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was the only thing she had ever trusted. Holt had been quietly transferred off the base. No announcement. One morning, a chair at the morning briefing was empty, and by the afternoon, it was occupied by someone else, and by the following week, the someone else had been there long enough that the absence of Holt was no longer a shape in the room, just the room. Driscoll was still there, more subdued. Yates was still there, in a different section, doing his work with the industrious invisibility of a man who has recently understood the consequences of visibility. The base had recalibrated, not fundamentally. Fundamental recalibrations of institutional culture do not happen in the months following a single incident, no matter how well documented. But operationally, in the immediate physical sense, the environment had shifted. She could feel it in the room temperature, in the way briefings ran, in the small behavioral adjustments that aggregate into climate. The climate was different. She did not take credit for this. Climate was not hers to take credit for. What she had done was specific. She had identified an injustice, documented it, absorbed it past the point where absorption was professionally sustainable, and then addressed it with the planning and precision of a person who had been trained to handle situations under pressure. The climate change that followed was a secondary effect, and secondary effects were the business of institutions, not individuals. She thought about this on a morning run in early April, the temperature already creeping up though it was barely past sunrise. She thought about what the word change meant in this context. She had not joined the military to change it. She had joined it because it was the thing she had been aiming at since she was 11 years old in a plastic lawn chair at a backyard barbecue in Clover, Virginia. She had gone through BUD/S because she believed she belonged in the operational world and had wanted to be there on the terms the operational world demanded. Not the lowered terms, not the adjusted standards, not the accommodation. The real terms. She had earned her place on those terms. What happened after that? The resistance, the calculation, the 6 weeks of absorbed harassment, the Tuesday morning, the meeting, the IG, none of it had changed that. She had earned her place. Everything else was the environment responding to something the environment had not expected, and environments responding to unexpected things were nothing new. She had been trained to work in environments that were actively hostile. An environment that was merely unprepared for her was, relatively speaking, manageable. She ran. The desert did what deserts do. The sun made its commitments. She finished her miles and went to work. In the 3rd week of April, a letter arrived. Not a formal communication. Not something through official channels. Not an IG follow-up or an administrative action. An actual letter, written by hand, on plain paper, in an envelope with a base mail designation that told her the sender was still on base or had been recently. She opened it at her desk. It was from Corporal Reese. Reese, who had been the youngest of the 3 men on the track. Reese, who had told the truth to the IG's investigators. Reese, whose name had appeared in the documentation in a way that would have been professionally costly for him, and who had, as far as she knew, paid something for the honesty. The letter was 2 paragraphs. She would not reproduce its specific language because it was his language and it belonged to him. But what it said, in substance, was this: he was sorry he had been there. He was sorry he had not stopped it sooner. He was not apologizing on behalf of Holt or Driscoll. He was clear about that, precise about the limits of the apology. He was apologizing for himself and his own presence on the track and his own silence in the moments before she stopped and turned. He said he had never seen anything like what happened on that track. He meant it as a compliment. He said He had been thinking about it for 2 months, and he thought she should know that he had been thinking about it. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her personal file, the one she kept separate from the operational file, the one that held the things that were hers rather than the things that were the mission's. She sat for a moment. She thought about Reese. 23, maybe 24. Young enough to still be in the process of deciding what kind of man he was going to be. Old enough to have made some choices about it, and discovered they were the wrong choices and done something about that, which was a specific kind of growth that the military sometimes produced and sometimes crushed depending on the environment, depending on the command, depending on who was watching, and what it cost you to be honest. She thought about what it had cost him. She thought about what it had cost her. She thought about Dennis in the lawn chair, who was not a villain. He was a retired corporal at a backyard barbecue who had said a thing that men of his generation said with the complete unself-consciousness of people who had never been required to examine it. He was not the problem any more than Holt was the whole problem or Cutler was the whole problem. The problem was a thing that lived in the space between people, in the assumptions they carried into rooms, in the habits of a culture so old that it had become invisible to most of the people inside it. You cannot fix that by winning a fight on a track. You cannot fix that by filing a perfect complaint at 0730. You could maybe be one data point, one specific, documented, irrefutable data point in a very long argument. She put the file away. She went back to the targeting matrix. The deployment ended in the first week of May. She flew back on a transport with 43 other personnel, and the flight was the specific quality of miserable that military transport flights are, noise and discomfort and a quality of suspended time that is unlike any other temporal experience. And she slept through most of it, which was the best thing you could do on a military transport flight, and also a skill she had developed through years of necessity. She landed at the East Coast Naval Facility on a Tuesday morning. She spent 3 days on administrative reintegration, the procedural work of returning, the debriefs, and the equipment returns, and the medical checks, and the paperwork that exists to verify that you are the same person you were when you left, adjusted for the ways deployments make you briefly a different person. She went through it methodically, efficiently, without impatience, which was the only way she knew how to go through it. On the 4th day, she drove to Clover, Virginia. Her parents' house was exactly as it always was. The hardware store was 3 blocks from it, and her father's truck was in the driveway, and her mother's garden was in its spring state, ambitious and slightly overgrown, which was the state June Voss considered optimal. She pulled into the driveway and sat in her car for a moment before going inside. The house, the garden, the hardware store truck, the specific proportions of a childhood home scene through the eyes of an adult, smaller than memory made it, more specific than memory made it, containing the particular weight of everything that had started there. She went inside. Her mother heard her in the kitchen and came out wiping her hands on a dish towel and said her name in the way mothers say names they have been waiting to say. Her father appeared from somewhere in the back of the house, moving with the slightly stiff walk of a man in his late 60s who had spent a lot of years on concrete floors, and he looked at her with the quiet look that Robert Voss had used her entire life to communicate what he found difficult to say directly. She was here. She was whole. She was back. They ate dinner the first night with Marcus and his wife, and Terrell came the following evening, and the table was loud in the specific way of that family, overlapping and argumentative in the affectionate mode, full of references that needed no explanation, the shorthand of people who had known each other from the beginning. She sat in it and let it move around her and felt something she recognized as home, which was a word she used carefully because home for her existed in multiple registers and she had to be specific about which one she meant. This was the original one. On the second afternoon, she sat with her father on the back porch. It was a mild May evening, the Virginia spring doing the thing it did in May, generous, full, the air carrying the smell of cut grass, and something she could not name that was simply the smell of that specific place. Her father sat in his chair the way he always sat in it, looking out at the yard with the contained, patient quality of a man who had learned to be at peace with stillness. She told him what had happened. Not all of it. Some of it was not hers to tell, and some of it was classified in ways that made telling impossible. But the shape of it, the formation, the 6 weeks, the track, the meeting, the IG. He listened the way he always listened, completely. When she finished, He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the yard. "You okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Looked at the yard some more. "Did you handle it right?" he said. She thought about this. The way she thought about everything. "Actually, I think I waited too long," she said. "And then I handled it exactly right." He nodded again. "That sounds right," he said. They sat there in a May evening for a while, without needing to say anything else. The yard was the yard it had always been. The light was doing what spring light does in Virginia, going gold, and then pink, and then the particular blue-gray of dusk. She could hear her mother inside, the sound of the television, the sound of dishes. She thought about Dennis, about the lawn chair, about being 11 years old and not having the words yet. She looked at her father. "Dad," she said, "do you remember Dennis? Your friend Dennis, the one who used to come to the cookouts." Her father thought for a moment. "Dennis Hartley," he said. "Sure. When I was 11, I told everyone at the cookout that I wanted to join the military," she said. "And Dennis said little girls don't go to war." Her father looked at her. "I don't remember that," he said. "I know," she said. "You do." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry I didn't say something," he said. "You didn't know it mattered that much," she said. "That's okay." It was okay. It genuinely was. She had not brought it up as an accusation. She had brought it up because she had been thinking about sequences, about the long chain from that lawn chair to the morning on the track, to the briefing room, to the IG, to this porch. And she had wanted, in this particular evening, in this particular place, to close the loop out loud. To let the beginning of the story know it had an end. Or not an end. A place where she was now. "You turned out all right," her father said. "I turned out fine," she said. They sat until the light was gone, and the yard was dark, and her mother called from inside that there was pie, and they went in. She was at the base 2 weeks after returning from leave. Back in the rhythm, back in the work. Her team had a rotation coming up in 6 weeks, a different region, a different set of operational parameters, and there was planning to do, preparation, the substantial work of getting ready for the next thing without being distracted from the current one. She was good at this. The continuous management of multiple temporal registers, the present that required attention, the near future that required preparation, the background processes that hummed along without demanding the foreground. The background process running during those 2 weeks was the IG report. Not anxiously. She was not an anxious person, and she had long since accepted that institutional processes had their own timeline that was not responsive to her calendar. But she was aware of it. Tracking it the way you track a piece of infrastructure you've set in motion and are waiting to land. It landed in the 2nd week of June. The findings were not public. They were distributed through proper channels to the relevant commands, which meant she learned about them through her own command structure rather than a press release. What she was told was this. The complaint was substantiated. The pattern of conduct by Major Holt and 2 additional named individuals was found to constitute workplace harassment in violation of Department of Defense policy. General Cutler received a formal letter of counseling for the formation incident. A formal letter of counseling. She sat with that for a moment. It was not, she thought, commensurate. A letter of counseling was the kind of finding that lived in a file and affected very little unless it accumulated. A letter of counseling for a brigadier general was the institutional equivalent of a strongly worded gesture. She had known this was a possible outcome. She had not been naive about what the investigation might or might not produce in terms of consequences for someone of Cutler's rank. The military did not, as a structural matter, dismantle generals over letters of counseling, and she had filed her complaint knowing this. The complaint had not been about destroying careers. It had been about making a record, about making the conduct visible in the institutional sense, putting it in the file, into the official architecture, into the place where it had to be named as what it was. She had done that. The letter of counseling was proof that she had done that. She filed the information and went on. What she did not know, in that 2nd week of June, was that the story was not contained to the base. The IG investigation had introduced her account into a broader institutional network, not as gossip, not informally, but through the proper channels that proper investigations use. Those channels had reached a number of people who were not on that base, and not in that command structure, but were in positions to make decisions about people and units and cultures. One of those people was a vice admiral named Patricia Chun. Chun was one of 7 women who had held flag rank in the Navy at the time. She had come up through aviation, had commanded a carrier air wing, had spent 20 years navigating the same specific physics of environments that were formally welcoming and structurally unprepared. She was not given to sentiment. She had not built a career in that culture by leading with sentiment, but she was given to precision, and she was given to the kind of attention that finds the specific instances that tell the broader story. She had read the IG report. She had read the documentation. She had noted the timestamp on the complaint, 0730, and she had read the note in the record about what Sarah had said to the investigator. The institutional math, the 6 weeks, the finding that lived underneath the finding. Chen reached out to Sarah's commanding officer. The reaching out was informal. A conversation. The kind that happens over the phone between flag officers and does not produce a paper trail, but does produce a change in how things are seen and understood. What Chen said, in substance, was she had a set of requirements coming up. Some of them intersected with Sarah's specialty. She wanted the conversation to happen at the right level. Sarah's commanding officer called her in. She sat across from him in his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and he told her that Vice Admiral Chun had expressed interest in her next assignment. She looked at him. "Chun," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Processing." "In what capacity?" she said. "Special advisor role," he said. "SOCOM level." The details would come from her office. She looked at the wall for a second, not checking out processing. The specific, rapid way she processed things that were significant and needed to be understood before they were responded to. "That's a significant rotation," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is this connected to the IG finding?" she said. He looked at her. "Would that change your answer?" She thought about that. "No," she said. "It wouldn't." He nodded. "Then it doesn't matter." She went back to her desk. She sat for a while. Not long. She was not a person who sat with things for long once they were decided, and this was decided. But for a moment she sat and let the sequence run in her head from the beginning. 11 years old, Dennis, the list, Bud/S, the deployment, the base, the formation, the track, the meeting, the letter from Reese, the porch in Virginia, the IG report, this office, this desk, the afternoon light coming through the window at the same angle it always came through. She thought about Vice Admiral Chun, who had come up through aviation and commanded a carrier air wing and spent 20 years doing her own version of the institutional math. She thought about what it meant that Chun had called, not as validation, she did not need it validated, but as information about the shape of things, about the way one person's specific documented action could become a data point in a longer argument, and the longer argument could shift something even slightly, and the shifting of something slightly was how large things changed. Not in the dramatic way, not in the headline way. In the slow, structural way that was the only way real things changed. She opened her calendar. She scheduled a call with Chen's office for the following Friday. She had preparation to do. She was good at preparation. Outside her window, the base was in its afternoon configuration. The specific sound of a military facility at 1,500 hours, busy and organized, machinery and voices, and the distant sound of a helicopter somewhere. She had sat in this workspace for the better part of a year now. She knew its sounds and its light and the way the air conditioning worked harder than it should and the specific creak of the third floorboard in the hallway outside. She was going to leave it soon. The next thing was coming, as it always did. The next rotation, the next deployment, the next room full of people who would look at her and make their initial calculations and then, over time, recalibrate. She was good at recalibrations. She pulled up the preparation file and started reading. The ceiling fan turned. The afternoon moved. She worked. Outside, a long way away, in a military courtyard on a base in a country whose name would not appear in this document, the sand was just sand. It did not remember Tuesday mornings. It did not remember the specific weight of what had been decided in its presence. But the people did. And people, unlike sand, carry things forward. They always do.